Hello, my name is Hamlet Dobbins, and this is Memphis Material, an oral history project chronicling the stories of the visual arts in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis Material is a podcast celebrating the personal histories, the intimate stories, and the studio practices of some of the people who help shape the creative landscape of our city. These unedited interviews are all recorded at the Memphis Listening Lab, an archival gem located in the majestic Crosstown Concourse in beautiful Midtown Memphis. The website for Memphis Material was designed by the wonderful Brian Dixon. Now, we do not have sponsors for this project, but if we did, today's interview, the first of two interviews with Patricia Lee Daigle, would be sponsored by Moms That Hang Prints or posters from Robert Motherwell, Paul Klee, Mark Rothko, and Henri Matisse in their houses. Now, this interview with Patty was recorded on January 17th, 2025. Enjoy the interview. So let's see. So last time we talked a bunch about high school transition from New Jersey to North Carolina.
Yes.
And undergrad at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill.
Correct.
And then we ended up sort of leading up to your time at UCSB.
Correct.
But we didn't get into it too terribly much.
Yes.
And then also, P.S., I think we had some follow-up questions for your mom. Did you get a chance to check with your mom on the Motherwell and the Rothko? You didn't?
No, I didn't do my homework.
You didn't do your homework? Okay.
Sorry.
Note to self. I'm gonna tell
I was
everybody.
thinking about it this morning, actually.
You were
like, it wouldn't have been that hard to just ask her, but yeah, no. I'll have to follow up.
That's okay.
With you.
We'll let it slide.
Via email.
Okay, that sounds good. I'll dub it in. We'll just get the thing in there. Okay, so talk to us. We're sliding up into UCSB, and then
Yes.
you've made your decision to go not to do an American Studies degree.
Correct.
But
yeah.
instead.
Yeah. So I had a choice between going to NYU for their I think it was visual culture or visual studies program, or UC Santa Barbara for like a more traditional art history program. And one was very much paid for and funded, and the other one was not. The NYU program was like a MA, and then you could continue on, but you had to like reapply for the Ph.D. program. And I kind of just wanted, I knew I wanted to get my Ph.D. And so, all signs kind of pointed to Santa Barbara, and it seemed like a good place for me, although it's not, the center of the art world necessarily. I think at that time I wasn't even sure that I would go into contemporary art. So I think I really wanted to kind of get that academic training and footing, and it seemed like a good place. One of my professors, I can't remember if I mentioned this last time, but at UNC, had just finished her PhD there before coming to UNC. So kind of speaking to, like lineages and how, like who you have in college and undergrad can make a big difference in like where you end up. And yeah.
Right. Now, did you have a little time off in between one and the other? You just went straight through?
Yes.
That must have been, was it sort of exhausting?
So this was around 2006, and it was like right on the cusp of the Great Recession, and it just did not seem like a good time to enter the workforce, especially with like a BA in art history and anthropology. I wasn't sure really what I would do professionally at that point, and I think like having parents who both, in my own lifetime, I remember them being in grad school. It just seemed like kind of like the next step. Now, since then, I don't necessarily recommend, to younger folks making that leap. And I think I've, found moments where certainly I question, like, is this the right decision? But you're like in it. But there's also like, you don't also know what it's going to be like unless you take that leap too. So, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, but yeah, it surely is
what is
mentally exhausting.
What was the school like? What was the city like? I've never been to Santa Barbara.
Yeah, it's like a mid-size city on the beach. Very nice. It's the city itself is quite transient feeling because, and the school is quite separate from downtown, kind of like Memphis in a way. Um, but like the actual permanent residents of the city, like it does skew like certain ways. Like they're older folks, it costs a lot to live there. There's a big Latinx community there as well. But there's also a big wealth gap. In some ways, kind of similar to Memphis in a strange way. Yeah, so they're kind of like two different worlds smashed into one. And then there's the university kind of like in its own bubble. But, it has like its own interesting history. So I worked at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art for about 8 years while I was living out there as a curatorial assistant. And yeah, it was interesting to learn about the city's history through art as well, and like kind of looking back at the collection and how it grew. And the museum itself, I'm going to blank on the actual date, but it had been around for most of the 20th century, so it was a fairly well-established museum. So yeah, kind of cool thinking about like California's changing history over time. And
Now, was it one of those things where as soon as you got there, you ended up having this position at the museum? No.
Yeah. I, after my master's was finished, so I finished the coursework, and I think there was some sort of exam. That's kind of the point at which I realized I didn't want to maybe not go into academia. And then I realized, I hadn't had any museum experience up till that point. And so that's when I was like, I really craved additional skills beyond just teaching and doing research and writing, but I really wanted kind of like more applied skills. And that's kind of what made me turn to museums. Yeah.
Now, what were you doing there at the museum?
So I began as I was a curatorial assistant in the contemporary art department. My boss at the time, Julie Joyce, was my boss the whole time. And the way that museum is sort of organized is, I think they had 4 different curatorial areas at the time, like Asian art, photography, European art, like older European art, and then modern and contemporary. And so, I'm trying to think. Yeah, it was modern and contemporary. And again, I had no experience, so I really started off with like the most basic of things. But as you can imagine, over an 8-year period, and I worked part-time most of the time, but it really varied. Like sometimes it was more intense if we had a show coming up and things like that. So it did vary. But yeah, I mean, the position kind of grew over time, taking on greater responsibilities. And somewhere a few years in, I was given the opportunity to curate my first exhibition. And so that was a big permanent collection-based show of Latin American art from, like modern and contemporary Latin American art. But yeah, it was a great learning experience, and I'm thankful for Julie, as a mentor there. She had come from the academic gallery world. She was at the Luckman Gallery at Cal State LA for many years, and then came up for this position. And she was like an LA, like born and raised in Pasadena. And so it was great to kind of learn from her, and she had a really good eye, I think. And that was one of those like kind of intangible things that you only learn kind of through like osmosis and just being. And I think especially now, like people change jobs so frequently. And I'm really thankful for like being somewhere for perhaps too long, but like for a sustained period of time where I could really learn and grow and change, help the museum change too. And yeah, I feel like I really absorbed a lot in that time. So.
Now, what was the master's program there like? What talk to me a little bit about that, because I know that's also a time when you sort of move from a sort of broad-ish zone to a very finite, sort of tight zone.
Yeah, yeah. The master, I mean, in terms of coursework, you're taking kind of like general courses in various areas, usually based on faculty expertise and things like that. But we did have like a pro seminar and this kind of like basic, general theory type class in that first year. I'm trying to think. It's a pretty rigorous program, and I feel like the program got even stronger as time went on, which was exciting to see. So by the end, I was really quite pleased, like with where the program had gone. And yeah, it was a time also to like refine what my interests were for sure. This was like a point in art history too, when I think people were talking a lot about social art history and visual culture and things of that nature, like vestiges of the early 2000s, even a holdover from the 90s, perhaps. And I think that was and that was, partially, still from my undergrad days, something that I carried with me. But folks at UCSB were also very, I think I mentioned this last time, but also very open to new perspectives and being pretty, forward thinking about how, what our discipline could address. And that's something that I'm really grateful for because, especially after leaving and encountering other people sort of in the museum world and in academia as well, and just hearing about other sort of art history programs, I think I took it kind of for granted that they were pretty forward-thinking and flexible. I think in a discipline that I think historically can be very, especially in bigger cities or elite institutions, can be very kind of gatekeeping and very limited in a purview. Yeah, so it's been interesting to see where that's led me. And I think for me, in the work that I do now, I think it's been really wonderful to have that kind of educational experience because it's not something that I feel like I have to now really figure out. And it's kind of been at the foundation, I would say, of, my graduate education, even before then, honestly, even in undergrad. So, yeah.
Now, so some of this is sort of my ignorance
No.
and not totally knowing how the MA
Yeah.
slides into the PhD.
Yeah.
But if I remember right, basically you have a coursework.
Yes.
And then you're sort of done. And then
Well, you have to write a master's thesis, which is like a longer,
okay.
Heftier paper on a topic.
Okay. And then that slides into PhD time where you
Yes.
just are...
No, then it begins kind of all over again.
Whoa.
And then you do more PhD level coursework, which is effectively the same. Like, it's the same courses you have access to. It's not like they get harder or anything like that. And then you have exams in your major. You I think, I'm totally blanking on this, but you have a written exam in your field of study. So for me, was like American art, late 19th century through like early American modernism. My master's degree focus was on visual culture studies, kind of like as a field. And I ended up writing my master's thesis on a piece of sheet music, the illustration on the cover, which was about, it featured like a Zip Coon caricature, and that was sort of the main character and singing the song. But it was all about anti-Chinese sentiment, and it was about how this character would not eat chop suey. And I found it so interesting that these white songwriters and illustrators were like pitting two people of color against each other, which is a really common thing, or like immigrants and not, and so, yeah, that was the topic.
I'm going to need an explanatory comma. What did you say? A Zip Coon?
Yes. So that's like a racist caricature of typically a black male figure dressed in, and this is like from the 19th century and onward, but like dressed in what would be read as like European derived clothing, so like a long coat, slacks, but it's all done as a caricature, so it's like overblown, like shiny buttons, kind of dressed to the nines, but almost in an exaggerated kind of way.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I totally had never heard that.
Yeah.
But no, this is also one
How
of
did
my,
I get-
but this is one of my favorite things. Like,
Yeah.
I remember being at the academy, it was like, we would sit down to dinner and I would be like, so what do you study? And they're like, okay, so you remember how like in this one poem, the next door neighbor had a donkey. Okay, and so I'm studying the neighborhood where that donkey came from. Like, it was just insanely complicated
It is
and
really
nuanced.
specific.
So how did you find, just out of curiosity, how did you find this?
Honestly, I'm trying to think back. I should have studied again before going here. I forget how. I think I might have seen it reproduced in a book. I could be wrong about that, but I think even in college, I was really interested in like. I took that class, which I mentioned last time, I think, and it was about otherness. And like I remember one week in the semester, the topic was on stereotype and like why we study them, how do they get formed, and that was like a very impactful part of that course for me. And so I actually did several projects in grad school that sort of circulated around the idea of, how are stereotypes created, what aspect of that exists visually, and like why does that image carry so much power. So yeah, that was in my head. I was in California, and you don't learn much about, first of all, Asian American history, I think, in many places, but particularly growing up in Asheville. And I was really fascinated by, especially being in a program and studying American art, I was really interested also in some of that earlier history too, and what things were like, especially in cities where you have this kind of mingling and friction and sometimes allyship, and that really fascinated me because I think those are often stories that get left out of broader narratives about the United States, that people were here and they were they were doing important things and they were contributing to society. And so yeah, I was really interested in kind of learning more about that.
So just in terms of thinking about how you approach that illustration, I'm always interested in how people approach things from curiosity. How do they take an image? How do they begin to break it down? How do they investigate the sources? Can you talk a little bit about the research process in terms of finding that image? Because to me that sounds really great.
Yeah, I remember doing a lot of research on like sheet music generally, and like the importance of a good illustration, like a cover image. So some of the research went into that. But I think more broadly, like I was really interested in how these characters develop and like where they exist. And they're not just limited to sheet music, but they exist as characters that are on the stage in vaudeville performances. They are in, fine art paintings sometimes too, or artwork that surrounds them. And I think what I find so fascinating is like how an image like that can exist in different realms. And I think what was also really fascinating to me was like how pervasive like racial jokes, like what was perceived as racialized comedy at the time, was such a huge part of like American popular culture. Like you wouldn't think twice. Like it just was the norm. And to me, that was so fascinating, like how pervasive that was culturally. Yeah. So that's those were some of the main kind of questions I had. But, I think I've always been interested too in like how these things find their way into what we would deem like fine art or paintings and sculptures and things like that. Yeah.
So then when you finish your master's and you finish that paper, where do you go from there?
Yeah, so then, as I said, additional coursework, kind of refining your interests and ideas. I think, I had various thoughts brewing, and honestly, I think I like don't quite remember the genesis of my PhD topic, but I do remember there was a visiting scholar, and I was talking to somebody who one of our professors at UCSB, Lori Monahan, and Sally Stein was the visiting art historian, and we were just talking, and I think we were actually talking about like Lori was mentioning like U.S. bombings in Southeast Asia, and she mentioned like, oh, it's so fascinating about like the bikini, like the term and where it comes from, and she mentioned like that the U.S. was doing this like nuclear testing on Bikini Atoll out in the Pacific. And we started talking, and I don't quite remember how we got to this, but somehow, and I don't remember if I mentioned this last time, but my PhD topic, I sort of landed on the suntan as this kind of phenomenon and this practice. And I started to really look into it more as a practice, and then seeing where the visual kind of overlapped. And so for me, the project kind of rooted itself in that early modernist period. And I ended up really looking at U.S. art and visual culture from the late 19th century and then through about 1930. But looking at that transition in this country from pale skin to tan, especially amongst white folks. And I was interested in that physical transformation, that's a visual one on the body, but then also what's happening again in our visual culture that is being made in response to this. And so I looked at a really kind of wide range of material. Like it wasn't a project where I looked at like one specific artist and just did a deep dive into that, but I really kind of let that question kind of guide the project. And so, one chapter, for example, like focused on modernist primitivism and the sort of trend in this country by artists like Georgia O'Keeffe or Marston Hartley to start looking at Native American culture, but also people themselves. And so, I wrote about O'Keeffe and her move to New Mexico, but in that framework of, health, wellness, this return to nature. So yeah, it was couched within this broader kind of health topic, which was interesting to me. Like as cities grew, this sort of access to nature diminished, and for middle and upper class white folks, there was this desire to sort of get back to nature. And so you see all these different ways that that's happening. So like the scouting movement, for example, it really kind of like one question led to another, and it was a big project, but I think I learned a lot in that process, and I think it furthered that interest for me, which I think I've had for quite a while, which is thinking about that interconnectedness between things like race and the sort of body that it lives within and on, but then how that manifests culturally, and visually.
Well, one of the things I really remember about the conversation last time was how you talked about letting questions lead the pursuit, or to put the question first, and let that be sort of the questioning is the goal. To me, that feels really powerful, and I love hearing you talk about how that came about. There's this great book, we might have talked about it before, called All That She Carried by Taya Miles. Do you have that book?
No, but Brittany mentioned it to me.
I'll give it to you. She mentioned that I'll just give it to you.
Okay.
I will. I'll just give it to you. But it's about Ashley Sack, which was this bag.
Yes.
Long story short, this woman, Taya Miles, breaks down every aspect of this bag in the most interesting and beautiful way in terms of thinking about all of the different ways that it sort of connects.
Sure.
And so one of the reasons why I love asking people about their not just what it was that they were studying, how they got to it, but then all of the different ways that it sort of spun out from there. Now talk to me a little bit more about your time at the museum there in Santa Barbara. I mean, that sounds like that was a really powerful experience. 8 years, duh.
Yeah, it was. And I think it was interesting to be like going through my coursework, doing school, TAing here and there, teaching courses here and there, and then all the while like also developing this museum practice and kind of picking up those skills. So it was a lot here and there, but again, like in retrospect, a really great experience. But you know, it was tough. I mean, I'm sure you can imagine like preparing for exhibitions, putting together big catalogues. It is a mid-size museum, and so you wear many hats. And I was fortunate to kind of pick up on other skills, which I later used when I was more on my own. But you know, it was a great place to be, but it was hard. It was a lot of work too. But yeah, I got to work on really great projects during that time.
Well, you mentioned that first show. That sounded amazing.
Yeah.
Now, talk to me a little bit about that, because it sounds like that was the one that you were sort of in. That was your beginning point. Your
that
project.
was a few years in. But yeah, it was at this point I had familiarized myself pretty well with the permanent collection, and so. But it was a fairly substantial show. Like it was the big show for that season. So that was kind of intimidating, I would say, just as like the first thing I ever curated being this big thing. And so, yeah, but I think I got through it and it came together really well. And yeah, it was a really good process. And I think I had, really good colleagues that kind of helped me along the way. I think that job really hammered home for me the importance of mentorship. And it wasn't just my supervisor and my boss, but, I had really great colleagues, just other curatorial assistants who were there when I came in, who, helped train me as well. And so, like that institutional continuity, like I learned how important that was. And then like I later trained younger curatorial assistants. And I think that was really important to have some sense of stability and a process that continues. So yeah, I think that was important. That was something that I learned there for sure.
Now talk to me about the show, because you were drawn from the permanent collection.
Yeah.
And like, give me some idea of the amount of space that you were given to put on this exhibition.
I mean, I would say it was like close to 3,000 square feet.
Okay.
Somewhere in that, maybe 4,000 probably around 4,000 square feet. So it was a pretty big area. I think it was like from the 1930s through the 90s. It was across all media. It was called Myth and Materiality. And, I think it's tricky when you're dealing with when you have like a remit, which was like, we haven't gotten a lot of our Latin American art out in a while. Like, we want to show off our collection. And so it was important to kind of have this broadness to it. But that was something that I had to learn with that experience, was like, how do I have a survey, but it still be meaningful and not just like A to Z or like this guy to this guy, And so,
because I would imagine a lot of those artists you might not have been familiar with,
yeah,
and so there's probably a lot of like back work
yes.
that you have to do to bring yourself up to speed.
It was also a great lesson in like, you can teach yourself anything, which I think as an educator, right? Like just staying one step ahead. But yes, like I hadn't, I'd taken a few more colonial Latin American courses, but not modern and contemporary. And so it was a big learning curve, and did a lot of research, did a lot of, reading. And I just had to kind of build that knowledge in service of this show. But yeah, I mean, again, kind of to that theme of letting it kind of happen naturally. I think that those ideas, like, to me, the question is like, how do I make sense of this disparate material and like the things that I have gravitated to? And to me, like, these two ideas of sort of works that tended towards really pursuing myth came about. But then there were other artists who were like into like neo-concrete art and things like this, and other forms of abstraction that felt so invested in material and the sort of form. And to me, those were like two kind of polar opposites on a spectrum that I felt like the artists were oscillating between. And so that was sort of the premise of the show was that. So yeah,
that sounds really great. Now, thinking about that, I mean, again, I don't know anything about Santa Barbara. Was it one of those things where the museum where you were was kind of it, or were there other things that were going on in Santa Barbara as well?
I worked at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art, and it is the city's main sort of civic museum, and it has its own permanent collection. I'm trying to think how many I feel like it had like over 30,000 objects. Like, it was a pretty big museum. As I said, there were 4 curatorial areas and 4 curators, and each had their own assistant. So in that way, it was sort of like, I worked very closely with my immediate boss, and we did many projects together. And that's kind of how it worked there. But yeah.
Now, what were some things that you feel like, I mean, anytime we do that first show, especially a huge one like that, obviously we come out of that experience thinking, here were some things that I did right, and then here were some things that I did wrong. Were there things that came out of that experience that surprised you in terms of things that you did well or things that you didn't expect to happen during that project? P.S. I know I'm asking you about a thing that was a long time ago, but usually, like, for me, those first shows, or that first show, is such a oof, goodness, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it helped that, and I'm probably blanking on just how long. Like, it was a few years in, so that helped certainly, because I wasn't like new to the institution, and so that made it a lot easier. Like, I knew who to go to, and I had questions. Like, I'm remembering that we conserved a work that we had on view for that show, which was very exciting and great because we hadn't shown it for so long. And like another work we created a frame for. It was like a big plexiglass kind of lens, and it stood vertically, and it didn't really have good housing. And so I think I reached out to the artist who was still alive at the time for like instruction. So it was really great as a learning experience because, I got to do the things that curators do, but, in a sort of microcosm of like, we're going to, conserve a work. We're going to build, we're going to talk to artists and get their blessing and their expertise and advice on how they want their work to be shown. So, there were a few things for that show that it was a great learning opportunity. I'm thinking about lessons that I took away. I think, making sense of it had a lot of work. It didn't feel heavy, but and that was a gift from my boss. She's somebody who doesn't really pack in a show. That's something that I kind of took away, I think. But yeah, I mean, I think you can always improve on, like, if I recall, there wasn't really like different sections. Like, there were sections in my mind and I installed the show with that in mind. But I don't think there were actually like section texts. And I think that would have really also helped, especially when you have kind of like a more heady idea and so many works from such a vast period of time. Like, things like that I think would have been helpful. But I mean, I like thinking back on it now, like it was pretty ambitious. Like we did a brochure, it was bilingual, like we did a lot of things. And yeah, it was kind of a lot. But like it worked out. Like I think it was pretty good. So it was a great kind of first experience, even though it was, at first I'm like, this isn't my area. Like, I felt out of my comfort zone for sure. But like, I think I learned a lot, and it's a great lesson in tapping into what you do know, like I took Spanish in high school and like had to use it, and so it tapped into a lot of things that I hadn't been using at that time. But yeah, and then since then, I have this like now knowledge of Latin American art that has helped me a lot since then. So yeah.
No, thinking about that, I mean, I know some folks that might be listening might be more on the maker side of the visual arts, but I'm interested in how you, as a curator, as someone who was doing that show, yes, when you finished it, how does one gauge success or accomplishment in a particular task like that?
Yeah. I think it comes from a lot of sources. I think obviously there's like reviews and press about the show. And
wait, there's what now?
Press.
People.
Yes.
People write words about it in the newspaper.
Yes.
Okay. Huh. All right.
Maybe less so these days,
right.
But then, there was good press, pretty locally. Although, I think being close to LA, you get a little bit more press that way. And I remember, like working with the local Spanish language newspaper, and it was like really exciting to see a review in Spanish too. And so that was like very rewarding for me. And then also I think for me, like when I go and look at the installation shots afterward, to me that's like oh man, I this looks great. or you're like, oh, like I maybe should have done this a little differently, or and I think that's where I see a lot of like whether I did it or not, or things that could be improved, is in some of that photography. But you just hear great feedback. You see people in the show responding well. It felt like, I think you can feel when you've done it or not.
And then also just the hindsight, anytime you look back on a project, of course, we have some projects where we're like, oh yeah, I wasn't feeling well that year or whatever.
Yeah.
But that sounds like that's a really good experience.
It was. And my boss, Julie Joyce, I think there are a few things that I like really remember, and one of the things she told me, which I have had to tell myself, is she's like, Patty, they're not all going to be winners. And I was like, you're right. Like, we're human, and I think if you put that amount of energy into everything you do, like, I think there's a relative scale sometimes, and it makes sense to me, like, why I poured myself into this thing, right? Like, it was the first time, and it was a big thing, and I felt this like enormous pressure to meet that,
and responsibility.
I
mean, it's a heavy thing to be thinking, like, we have these objects, some people are living, some people are no longer there, and the responsibility, especially when you're given such a huge space. Mm-hmm. I mean, I know it can be kind of overwhelming. But it seems like that was something that worked really well, that fit really well with your temperament. I mean, obviously you had that support structure, which was really great.
I think that's really what was key. For sure. I mean, I think, but I can only say this because I'm many years removed from it. I'm sure I was like freaking out and totally haggard, and but it helped. A support structure is everything, and also just like where to go to get those questions answered, and to have them answered well. like by someone who is an expert or whatever, like who has that knowledge, is really critical. And yeah, it's needed to make a successful thing.
So you were there for 8 years.
Yes.
Talk to me, were there other projects that stand out in terms of, I mean, I know you're like, I'm not even going to mention them, Hamlet, because you're going to make them into a pop quiz. But were there other projects that you did when you were there? Other experiences that you had at that museum that were particularly pivotal?
So the first show when I first started that I sort of assisted on was Yinka Shonibare. And it was his first show west of the Mississippi. And I think this was 2008. And that was just like an incredible first art experience, as you can imagine. But just, it was all installation. There was some photo as well, like large scale photography, but mostly sculptural installation. And it was just such I think that was significant for me because it was a little bit outside of, I think, what you would typically think you're going to walk into in an art museum. And so that was just a really fun experience. And then,
I mean, speaking of responsibility, you were saying that was like one of the first exhibitions. I mean, and for sure, one of those artists that you recognize really early on is going to be around for a long time and really important.
Yeah.
I mean, that must have also been a huge, not a heaviness, but a huge sense of responsibility and also delight.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think I truly understood the magnitude of what we were responsible for at the time. And I realize now, my boss, who was the curator of contemporary art, was also fairly new at that time. That was, I think, her first big show. And so I think, there's this sense of responsibility to her as well. And her career's on the line too. But what I was going to say too is, we didn't have a contemporary art historian at UCSB at the time. We hired Jenny Sorkin kind of towards the end of my time there. So I didn't really have the benefit of taking courses in art history. And so the way I kind of always viewed my museum work too was getting this kind of hands-on, real world, real time education in contemporary art. And I think Yinka's show was so pivotal for me because it was also that time where I was like, wow, a lot of the things I've been interested in, exist certainly in the contemporary world. And it was really interesting to think about how an artist like that is obviously functioning now, but is addressing colonialism and things happening 200-300 years ago, and how he's navigating art history in a way that addresses so many complex issues, and how that can kind of manifest in one work. And I guess that's kind of like the sheet music cover. It's you start to unravel why is where did that come from? Why does that look this way? Why is it being used like that? And I think you can ask those same questions of artwork as well. And so that was really great to kind of see that what I'd been studying, what my interests were, could also really be useful and exist in a contemporary kind of art setting too.
No, I'm curious. You were saying that you felt like you were feeling like the museum work was a way for you to crack open the contemporary art world. Just thinking about that, how were you approaching that? Was it one of those things where you were making sure that you went to more contemporary art spaces? Was it something where you were reading a lot more art forum? What were the sources?
Everything.
Yeah. Okay.
I think even using the Latin American show as an example, but we also did a show called Pasadena to Santa Barbara, which was funded. The Getty had this, they still have this Pacific Standard Time series of exhibitions that are California focused. And they just, I think, did their third or fourth one. They did The first one was focused on Southern California art, and there was a time period, like a range. And then the second one was Latin American art, and I left shortly after that. And then they just did one on science and technology. And that project also, we did a project looking at a museum director that came to the Santa Barbara Museum of Art from the Pasadena Art Museum. And it kind of recreated like his tenure and brought back some of the works and artists that were shown at that time, which were very like forward thinking for that time. And it was like the 60s and 70s. And that was like a show where I just had to like dig deep into Southern California art history, which is, again, something that I didn't really learn in the classroom, but something that I learned while doing all this research and writing about all these different artists. And so things like that, but also, becoming part of that, the art community there. We worked with several, Santa Barbara-based artists for various things throughout my time there. But yeah, it was really that wide range of that. And it's interesting because, like it's an art history department, but like how do you teach contemporary art history too? And obviously you go back a little bit, but part of, I think, and this as an educator and somebody working with living artists and, kids who are going to go on to become part of this world. And I think what you teach them too is like getting out there and becoming part of this community and going to talks, going to openings. And so, that was all part of it.
I mean, that's like another job on top of a job. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
I mean, it's one of those things where obviously you come into it with your skill set, and obviously a lot of that skill set can be sort of transferred from one area to another. But then also just in terms of like, especially a large museum like that, each show, I would imagine, would carry with it its own massive educational component for you, as well as the educational department and everything else.
Maybe that's why I was there for so long, because, every opportunity was this kind of, for me, I felt like this learning opportunity. And grad school is also a very long process. And I certainly made it longer by working, simultaneous to going to school. But I really think that it was kind of this, again, in retrospect, a very invaluable thing to do. And I didn't totally realize it at the time, but with each passing experience, it's like, no, I think this is good for me, And so, but I mean, it was like working many jobs at once, especially if I was teaching. I mean, it was crazy.
I mean, in some ways, that's such a great thing because we're never bored.
Yeah.
Like anything that we do, it's going to be a different thing every show and everything. Now, you mentioned teaching. Was that something that came naturally to you, or was that something that was more of again, kind of a learning curve thing?
I enjoy, like, I think I'm a people person, so I enjoyed, the students and the sort of conversations. And the lectures, and I think I would have benefited from like more training on like this is how you put together assignments, and had a little bit more guidance, I think, and mentorship with that. And I realize that job has gotten even more complicated since I left academia in terms of like AI and the internet and online courses and all of that. I think that's like the less glamorous side of academia that nobody talks about and that nobody trains you for. And you kind of just learn the hard way. So that obviously did not come super naturally to me. And I think you're always like, it's interesting because like, I mean, yes, we change as educators, but the students seem to change faster in terms of like what students are willing to do. Like, where do they get their information from? How do they do assignments? Like that changes ever more rapidly, I would say. And so those are the things that like, I just was not prepared for. But that was like back when things moved a little slower. And by the time I left, I was like, I can't do this anymore.
Now, what classes were you teaching?
I taught American art history courses. I think I taught a 20th century class while at UCSB. And I really enjoyed it. It was like a survey, like an upper level survey class. And it was exciting. Like I remember distinctly like going back to some of my like college syllabi and being like, what did I like? Because I just want to teach them those things. And, you know, do the greatest hits, but like from the things that I found compelling, you know.
Were there areas that you felt like, oh, this is my favorite, or you know, I love this part, you know what I mean?
Teaching art history?
I mean in terms of like segments or areas or movements.
Yeah, I think it was always fun to teach them about like land art. That was really like, again, this very kind of atypical thing that I don't think a lot of students think much about, and it's also so like rooted in that time period. So I think it's always fun to kind of transport students, and this is the art history side of things, but you know, like always making them kind of see things through a lens that's like appropriate for that time period, because I think it's so easy to like look back on some of this older material with our contemporary glasses on and judge and question, and that's fine too. But I think like for students, trying to help them understand why something was so significant way back when, and to try to transport people into a culture that they're not familiar with anymore, in a time period that they're not familiar with. I think I enjoyed that aspect of teaching art history. Was that?
Now, what was it that drew you to land art?
Oh, that just went. I mean,
that was just an example.
Yeah.
But I mean, and like, not to sidetrack us or anything, but when I was in grad school, the main contemporary art historian guy was a big land art guy. And so like when you said land art, I was like, that's so crazy, because I totally had I mean, it was one of those things that was like a little itty bitty little blip in the book, you know, that no one ever talked about, you know, in the great surveys.
I just think it's like, to me, it signaled like a much bigger shift in the art world, in thinking about like where art could be experienced. That was like, to me, felt like such a big departure. Like you can talk about like commercialization and that, and I don't know, it like materiality and the sort of ephemeral nature of things. And it seemed like there were a lot of really interesting things you could talk about by talking about that shift. And I think too, just being on the West Coast and thinking about the environment too seemed to be really relevant for a lot of students. I think those were just, it opened up a lot of discussion.
And it's kind of one of those extreme things.
It is
that kind of like blows people's minds.
Yeah.
You know, where
so fun.
Where you're just like, this is a whole nother world, and you get to like freak them out.
Yes.
Okay.
Which I think is always like great, because
we're really why we do it.
Yes.
We just like to see our students go, what?
Yeah.
Wait a minute.
Correct.
Yeah. All right. So from Santa Barbara, what ends up happening then?
After?
Yeah.
So I finished my Ph.D. in 2015. As I said, it was a long haul.
It's so loud. Okay.
It was quite.
It was like.
Although I kind of got used to it.
That was rumors, but. Okay, so what ends up happening when you get your PhD and you're all done?
Yeah. So by this point, I am married. Sorry.
Well, okay. So you mentioned Bernie. So
Yes.
how did you guys meet?
We met through the very, like going on the record saying this.
Well, you could
the early days of online dating.
Okay.
Before there were like apps. Like I didn't even have a smartphone when we called them smartphones. Like I just had like we had regular phones.
But he was there in
And so-
California.
yeah, he did grad school up at Stanford and did his PhD there in genetics, which he doesn't totally do in that purest form up there. But he always has kind of had a computer science computational interest. And he was doing a postdoc at UCSB. And that's what brought him to Santa Barbara. So when we met, he had just been there for about 3 months. So he was like a new guy in town. But yeah, we met on campus for our first date. And we walked over to like the adjacent neighborhood where all the like undergrads live to get lunch. But yeah, it was great. I mean, his family at that point had moved from Pittsburgh, where he grew up, to the Charlotte area in North Carolina, and our parents were, an hour and 45 minutes apart. His brother was in grad school at UNC Chapel Hill in nuclear astrophysics, doing his PhD there. So like we had all these things in common. So there was a lot to talk about. But yeah, that's kind of where we met.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, the reason I ask is that I think a lot of times in these interviews, some of that like big decisions in terms of like where people end up or how people end up in a particular place or where they end up in a particular area of study can sometimes have to do with some of those external sources as well.
Totally.
So that's always good to throw in there.
Because otherwise it makes like no sense. Right. So our move to Memphis was largely kind of governed, I would say, and driven at the time by Bernie's job search. So he wanted to go into academia. He went on the job market, applied to like God knows how many places, was doing all these interviews, very stressful while I was finishing up my dissertation. And so I think by the time I literally like graduated and walked, we knew we were coming to Memphis. So he had just gotten an offer from U of M. And so he's in the biology department there. And that's what brought us here. And I remember that summer kind of like looking for positions. Like I familiarized myself with the museums here. Like I applied to like different places all around town. And then I remember I was in Brazil with my boss at SBMA at the time, and we were working on that a different Latin American project, a solo show for an artist named Valesca Suarez. It was also funded by that second iteration of those Getty PST grants. And she and I were in Brazil, and one of my UCSB colleagues was like, "Oh, I just saw this job posting at U of M. Aren't you going to Memphis?" She was like, "It sounds perfect for you." And so she sent it to me, and like I remember telling my boss about it, and I was like, "Will you write me this recommendation?" And and I applied when I got back to California, and I felt very lucky to get that position. And as you know, it was a combined gallery director and visiting art history professor position. And I think you mentioned this last time, but it was like, who's going to do this really random job? And it was me. So, I remember being like, yeah, this is super random, but I think I can do it, having taught like survey courses and, as I've said, just teaching myself many a thing over time. But yeah, so that was really great that just we lucked out in that way. And I remember people were like, "Oh, like, did you manage a dual hire?" And we're like, no, this was like totally random that this happened to come up at the time it did. And I feel like, I've been very lucky in terms of timing throughout my career. But there are periods where I've had to be pretty patient as well. So
I've been lucky, but also I've had to wait.
Yeah,
that sounds right.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
But now I'm interested. You're making this shift. You were in Chapel Hill, then Santa Barbara, and then bam, Memphis. Mm-hmm. And so I know it's one of those things where like it is obviously a huge change, but I'm curious, what were some things that you noticed, thought about as you came to this new city in terms of your fresh eyes?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, like I know people say this, but like it really felt very palpable. The like history and culture of this city felt like you could feel it, first of all, very like palpably. And there was something about it that also felt very like authentic and not phony. And another thing that I noticed was like people were fiercely proud of Memphis, and I think still are. And that was really refreshing to like encounter all of that, because I would say Santa Barbara, like, you know, it was beautiful and there are many things to be proud of. But, like, people were kind of in a bubble, and I think that's something that like, and I think California being where it is, and you can lose sight, I think, of what's going on in the rest of the country and perhaps world, but more so like the rest of the United States. And I think being here, like you're like right in it. Like you can't ignore that and what's going on around you. And so, that certainly like wears on you over time. But that was kind of, at that point, was a very refreshing change, I think, to have that kind of like civic passion and that kind of like very visceral sense of culture. That wasn't like, didn't feel manufactured or like top down. Like it just felt kind of organic in the way it cropped up. And, you know, I came in 2015 that summer, and there was a lot going on in the city. This building that we're sitting in right now, you know, Crosstown was in its like really, you know, I think construction had been underway, and there was a lot of momentum there. And it was just like a really exciting time to be here, I think. And I know Memphis has had like these phases of momentum, but I think we moved during one of them. And I've since seen the sort of like denouement of like that. But it was an exciting time to start somewhere new. And it was exciting to be closer to, you know, where my family is. And just also like in a more diverse city, I would say. Like Santa Barbara was very kind of white and Latina, like a sprinkling of Asians, and that was about it, and not many Black folks. And that was a nice change as well. And actually something that I like feel when I travel somewhere else that isn't that way. And then I come back and I'm like, oh, this is like nice to be back here, frankly. Like I kind of missed that. And and my high school was, I think I mentioned this, like a very black-white kind of space and place to be. And so it felt familiar in that way. And I remember people thinking that I was like from Santa Barbara or California, and they were like, are you okay? Like, are you doing all right with this like culture shock? And I'm like, well, it's not like the biggest culture shock. Although it still will shock you in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, there's a bunch of interesting stuff there. I mean, you know, you come in and you're teaching, and then you're also organizing these shows. Talk a little bit about how that the Fogelman galleries shows were sort of set up. Was it one of those things where, if I remember right, there was a committee?
Yeah, there was a committee formed of mostly faculty, if I recall correctly. So there was like a mix of some of those recommendations, and then a mix of some like folks that I was interested in, and then obviously also doing the student shows at the end of each semester. And the first few shows that I kind of walked into, one of which was yours, and then Lester Merriweather, on either side of the gallery spaces. And then I think I also, the show after that, yes, this is all coming back to me now, was a guest curated show by Carol Crown, and then a show by Bruce West, who's a photographer, who, similar theme. And yeah, those were kind of what I kind of inherited. But it was nice to not have to kind of start from day one. But, you know, it was like, Carol wants to borrow like 40 works from local lenders. And it was like suddenly like, all right, we got to rent this box truck. And, for me, it was like I had to hit the ground running and just figure out how to do all that on the fly and be in the driver's seat, not literally, but Jesse, drove the van. But like still, it was putting all that stuff that I had absorbed and gleaned over the years and like actually then being in charge and doing it myself and
doing every aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it really was. I mean, you were talking about the setup before in Santa Barbara, the complete opposite in terms of a curatorial experience.
Totally.
Here you do everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a lot, but also good, again, one of these in retrospect, situations. But, I was thankful to have had all of that training, even like watching the guys put up vinyl, like back in Santa Barbara. Like I never did it, but I watched them do it like a zillion times, right? And so like when it's me doing it now, like it helped a lot. And, you absorb all these new skills. Like in my current job at the Brooks, I remember like we had a vinyl emergency and I was like, I'll just do it. And I did it, and it's nice to be able to like come through in that way. And, but it was a lot of work. And I think one of the biggest things for me was transitioning to like such a vastly different, pace. Like it was a crazy pace. Things were up for like a month and a half at most. And it's like a big area. Like I think that, it's a large space to fill. And so programming that for like 5 years was a lot. And just, obviously, as like having been in a university gallery as well, it's like just working within the university bureaucracy too can be challenging, like getting signage and other things that seem so easy suddenly become like so difficult, like many years in the making just to get like a sign or, so those were challenges for sure. And things that, I certainly took for granted being at a museum, just surprisingly a lot less bureaucracy. But there was also a lot of autonomy as well, which is, something that, I now, I have some autonomy, but certainly not to that degree.
No, I'm curious. One of the tricky things about this question is always like, okay, so I'm going to ask you what were some of the shows that really stood out in terms of being awesome. Now, the truth is, this is one of those questions where we can sit here and I'm totally happy to do this and we can just go through the phone and you can talk about every single show individually so you don't leave anybody out. Or you can just kind of be like, oh, hey, how about this? You only have 20 minutes, Patty, to tell me about some of the shows that really stood out. So if you miss some people, it's totally okay. And so you can leave me and Lester.
I'm going to start with you and Lester.
No,
because I'm going to be honest
out.
about this, because I will tell you my honest opinion of like walking into that. And I remember being like, I met you and I was like, wow, like I was just very impressed. And I'm not saying this because you're sitting in front of me, but I was like, wow, like this city has really great artists. Like these guys are legit and they're doing really wonderful, like impressive things. I remember you installed your show and like, I really liked the way you hung your show. And I just like, for somebody coming into this community new to it, I was like very relieved by like the quality of your work, but also just, you had experience in installing and just, it was great. And then Lester's show, certainly I think that was his whites only show. And I remember writing the text and I just remember thinking like, wow, like this is the kind of work that like I'm certainly very much interested in doing. And I had just finished basically writing a thesis on whiteness. Right. And so it was comforting to know, like, it felt like I made the right choice. I mean, I didn't have much of a choice, but that I was in an environment that really kind of like just through luck came my way, but like was still very appropriate and fitting for me and my interests. And yeah, so I will say that.
And then I
mean
also
it.
have to say that Lauren Kennedy came and gave me the okay on the install. I think she helped me move some things around. So little asterisk.
Okay. Yes. Side note. But yeah, some other shows that I remember doing and enjoying. I enjoyed doing that Sue Johnson show with all the vinyl on the walls. That was fun to work with her on that. And I remember she came, she did a show that was basically like a recreation of like a 1950s, 60s home. And she's somebody who is trained as a painter, but also worked in like digital collage. So she had scanned her paintings in and then like, stitched together like cutouts from magazines. And that was a fun show only because like I enjoyed the layeredness of those images, even though the final output was like this sheet of like commercial billboard vinyl. So it was fun to work with her. She was just very smart. And we kind of transformed the room into this kind of like you were walking into a house. And I remember she did these like floor decals in vinyl too. And she was all into like trompe l'oeil, like little doll houses with toys scattered on the floor. So it was just a fun show. And just from a technical perspective, like installing all of that, all the vinyl was a challenge, but it was, something I hadn't done before, like just wrapping the entire gallery in vinyl. I would say Erin Harmon's show stands out to me. And that was to me like when they were both strong, like was always also like really fulfilling to me, because it didn't feel like you like one was lesser, like, it was an easier install and whatever. Like when that could happen, that was great. And I remember she had her show up alongside Jefferson Pinder's show, which was also a great show and combined like video and large scale like sonic sculpture and this really cool wall piece that was like torn up lines from like road construction. And it was really great to work with both of them. Erin was really independent and really kind of just like knocked that out over winter break. But I remember, being really thankful and excited that she really embraced the opportunity to like really fill that space. And for her, she had done some set design prior. But in terms of like her own artwork, she had yet to really work at that scale, not for a set. And so that was really cool to see how like an opportunity can shift someone's practice into new dimensions. And that was really fulfilling as well. And Jefferson's show was just really fun and cool and powerful.
And I use he made kind of a mind map for the Funknik piece. Mm-hmm. And I use that every semester.
Did we have that in the gallery?
It was in the gallery. It was in the gallery.
Right.
And it was basically like a reverse engineered mind map where he just sort of talked about all these different things that went into that piece. Yeah, I remember both of those shows, and they were both really terrific and tremendous.
He's just a really smart guy, and I just, for me, like his practice is just super interesting because like he makes objects, but he does video, he does performance, and they take different forms, but there is like this continuity. And so for like a solo show, it works really well because there's this like diversity in media, but it feels still really like coherent together. And then I think back to Umar Rashid's show as well, and he was in both spaces, and I don't know how many times we ever did that, but that was that was a big undertaking. But that was really fun too, and that was a meaningful show. He's somebody that I had worked with in Santa Barbara, so to bring somebody from a previous experience here was really cool. And I think that was his first time showing in the South, and I think it was really meaningful for him too to, if you know his practice, he is really writing this like extensive ongoing narrative about the Franglish Empire, and it's this kind of like pseudo historical combining of different European colonial empires, and but often through characters that are not white necessarily. And I was just kind of blown away that he had never shown his work in the South, and so much of his work is like rooted in empire and slavery. And so it was just a really great, like, perfect opportunity for him to really expand his narrative and do things that were Memphis specific, which was very exciting, especially being new to this part of the country. And he really kind of did his research and picked up on indigenous cultures, mound builders and things like that. And then of course tapped into like the city's cotton history and all of that. And and that's just cool because it exists like in his body of work, right? And led to future projects and things like that.
Now, thinking about that job, I mean, you were talking about, like, obviously you've got some things that are sort of hardwired in. You've got those student shows that are always going to be there, and you've got these other things that are sort of a part of the factor. When you're choosing the artist, or when you're thinking about the artist to come, what are some things that you're thinking about? Because, I mean, it's a little different, obviously, than being in Santa Barbara, in that there are lots of other institutions here that do kind of different things. And so, like, I'm curious, how are you thinking about the Fogelman galleries in terms of the landscape and also how it plugged into the school?
I think having recently been at a university, right, and being in that realm and being in the classroom, I was cued in, and I was still in the classroom, but thinking about how it really could be this kind of teaching gallery. And what I think first and foremost, I was thinking about the students and what these types of shows and the artists that we would bring in would mean to them. And I think more or less throughout, we did a balance of local and regional, as well as, outside of Memphis, and people from across the country and even the globe towards the end. And I think, I can't believe I missed the Virginia Overton show that we did, was also in both galleries, actually. And that was a great example, too, of an alumna coming back. And, that was really meaningful, I think, for the students to see somebody who got their MFA from U of M and coming back and, doing amazing things and still taking the care and time to be here and show her work here was really special. But yeah, those were some of the considerations, was to kind of hit that balance. And then kind of going back to your point about, I think I always want to have these moments for students to either be surprised or, expand the mind a little bit. And that was also part of my hope, was to really kind of show a variety of media, a variety of types of practice too. We did some print shows over time. And so I think to just get that variety in for students would also really be important to me, because it's their opportunity to see what they're working on too, and what's possible. And so also artists who are good with students, and maybe our teachers themselves, people who could do great crits for the students was always a bonus. So yeah, those are just some of the things that I considered.
And then, I mean, I remember when I was working as a curator, I felt like such a huge part of my job was to be the tour guide as well. And so I'm curious, how did obviously also when you're working with living artists and they're coming to Memphis to do a show, there's a different kind of responsibility and a different kind of caretaking, but also tour guiding. How did that fit in? Did that fit pretty well with your temperament?
Yeah, I think so. And it became a bit of a sort of program in that like people would stay at the Holiday Inn, like there were certain things that were kind of fixed. Some artists like Umar, as well as Virginia, and there's there's a scrappiness to the gallery that I kind of miss in some ways that is very different than working in a museum, I would say. So there were a lot of like things that were site specific or people making things here, which I was less accustomed to, I would say. So that was new to me, but also like while stressful and like to the last minute, it was also exciting to see how people could respond to actually being here or even being in the gallery and like respond to the space. I remember Sue Johnson and I like went around to like thrift stores to like buy vintage phones and things like this and other objects to like put in her installation. I know Virginia sourced her materials here locally. I remember she used our gallery pedestals flipped upside down and made them into, water containing fountains. So, there were different ways in which that went down, basically, like how they would spend their time here. But yeah, I kind of, my temperament, like I'm not spontaneous, but like these folks encouraged me to like be a little more so, and I think, but I do think like at my core, I'm like, I can handle like working on multiple things, like some degree of uncertainty, and so that fit my temperament pretty well.
Well, like I remember like my entire time as a curator, I wasn't drinking and I had my kids.
Yeah.
And so like every once in a while someone would say like, "Hey Hamlin, are you going to take Roe Etheridge to Rayford's?" And I was like, No, I'm not. I'm just like, I never thought about taking them out dancing or anything like that. Now, we can definitely compare notes on where you took them to eat. I'm totally down with doing that. What was your go-to in terms of food?
Let me think here.
This is very important, Patty.
People were like installing a lot. So one thing I learned also, because I'm not an artist and I wasn't used to working in this way, was that like artists don't eat. They're like, I need to finish. Like when they're installing, they were like, order me a Subway sandwich. I'm not leaving. Like they wouldn't leave. And like, I'm very hungry. Like we need to, but yeah, that's actually the thing I remember most. But we'd often take like for nicer dinners, we would go to Beauty Shop a lot. We still do. As just like a place that I think is very Memphis-y and food's great. And,
yeah.
But yeah, we'd go to, I know you're a barbecue aficionado. So we would take them to various places. Where else would we go?
You know that I'm not just an aficionado, but I'm also very judgy.
I know.
About my barbecue. So let's not even talk about it, okay? So I'm going to make a new rule for the podcast.
Umar went on his own. I didn't tell him to go there, but I remember they went to One and Only before it closed down. And they were like, it was pretty good. And I was like, okay. But that's all I'll say.
That's okay.
Barbecue,
that's fine. That's okay. We'll let that slide.
Yeah, but I do just remember them like powering through these like installations against my, my wishes.
I love that thing that you said about going around town to the different thrift stores to get phones. I mean, to me, that was the gold. I mean, obviously the show is the gold, and obviously like people coming in, and then do you have that experience too, where when the show first comes in and everything's on the ground, you think it's gonna suck? Every time for me, like without question. Like you could be like the most amazing artist in the world.
Well, because it's on the ground.
Because it's on the ground. I'm just sitting there like, this show is going to suck.
For sure.
This is going to be the worst show we've ever done. Yeah. And then it gets on the wall and you're just like.
It's a lot better. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Lighting helps.
Good. I'm glad that I'm not the only one that has that experience.
Yeah.
So, any other kick-ass stories that come to mind in terms of thinking about doing the Fogelman galleries?
I mean, I think that was my first time really kind of like not living the artist's life, but like getting some glimpse into like what it really is required to be an artist and make your living doing that. And I don't think I truly had an appreciation of that working in a museum. And it's because there, like there's this certain sense of like this kind of like air of professionalism, like, there are preparators, like touch the work, it's a very different vibe than like, yeah, just help me put this up, or, like we're going to all move this together. And it's a much more, I would say, like closer experience, I think, to like being in the studio. And that's one of like the greatest takeaways from that experience, I think, is like, really like developing a deep respect and appreciation for what artists really do, I think, let alone like what goes on in the studio. But and then the other thing that kind of surprised me that I wasn't really expecting was I had never really worked with studio students before. Like that was my first time. And I would work with them to help install their shows and kind of go over certain things to do in advance and things like that. And that was also really fulfilling, was figuring out how I could, like, what could I contribute to their education as a curator? And that was exciting. It was great to like help them think through their work, but for like an audience, which I think a lot of them weren't really thinking about. And just, teaching them different skills. And yeah. And so I definitely miss that. And I'm glad to like come back to do critiques and things like that, because I enjoyed that part of the job.
Because you were also working with the students in an entirely different capacity, as the teacher. And so you had this like almost like dual position in terms of being able to interact with them wearing different hats.
Sure. And there were studio kids in the art history classes because it's a requirement. And like sometimes I would like have them like years prior in my World Art 1 classes, and then they would be like graduating, and it was exciting to already know them, but then like know this other side of what they do. And yeah, so I enjoyed that and was not expecting like that this would happen, and I just didn't know what to expect. But I missed that part of that job, actually. So.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I think one of the things that I did not expect, years ago I worked at FedEx, and there was that like, we got to get it in, we got to do it, we got to get it out, the clock is ticking, we need to go, and for me, that working at Clough Hansen was the same. I mean, it was like the work would come in, you would have an idea for a show, you would do the studio visit, the people would come in, they would do it, but there was this kind of like urgency, as the alarm sounds in the background, but there was this urgency. And then like, it's opening night, and I've picked the artist up from the hotel, and they're here, and the food is here, and we're ready to go. And so that kind of adrenaline rush, for sure, I think is a big part of it that is totally not a part of the museum life, or hopefully.
Well, that frenzy for sure is not there. So it's interesting now going back to museums. It's like, oh, like we have like 4 weeks between shows sometimes. Like sometimes we have like 3 to 4 weeks, and I'm like, this is crazy. And then like I'm not even doing it. Like I'm not deinstalling. I'm not. But like now going back to museums, like I have such appreciation for what my colleagues do, and I have a sense of just how much preparation and work that entails. And so, it helped me really see more holistically, like the big picture, and not just, at SBMA, like I knew what was involved, but to actually like do it is a whole other thing. And so that appreciation is like deeply real because, like I remember what it was like climbing a ladder a bazillion times to adjust lights, So, yeah.
That was a perfect segue. You were like, and then...
I also had 2 children at some point in that amount of time.
Yes, you did. Right. You grew 2 human beings and had 2 human beings.
That's correct.
And Now, just out of curiosity, and I ask this of all of my guests who are involved in the arts, artists who have kids, I'm curious, how do you think, or do you think your practice as a curator has shifted or changed at all since having kiddos?
Yeah. I mean, like, I noticed that in my now not new, but when I first started at the Brooks about 3+ years ago, like, I became, like, every show had, like, a dress up component in the interactive gallery. And I was like, but I became really cued into, like, how are kids going to experience this show? Like, and maybe not just the show, but like, what could we make in the interactive gallery that like could really make this fun and meaningful to them? Or like something that parents could like, you know, what is the word? Distract their children with so they can go enjoy the show, you know? And yeah, it certainly cued me more into like safety, like all of that, you know, because I've seen it happen now. So
Now, talk to me a little bit about the transition to the Brooks, because I mean, that obviously, again, is a huge shift and a change. Will you give us the parenthetical aside or the explanatory comma? What is it? What's your job? What do you do there at the Brooks?
yes, so I am curator of modern and contemporary art. I manage those collection areas and put together exhibitions and catalogs pertaining to those areas. We since I started, well, there's been a fellowship position called the Blackman Perry. It first started off as a curatorial fellowship in African American art and art of the African diaspora, and that position, I think about a little over a year ago, became a curator position. And so it's interesting in that there is some overlap, obviously, with my position. But, you know, I think it's not like I don't do work involving Black artists and vice versa. And so there's some fluidity in that. And I think it's nice. And yeah, we've made it kind of work pretty well, I would say. Yeah.
Now, how many curators are there?
There are currently 4 curators. Rosamond Garrett is our chief curator and curator of European and decorative arts. And then I have a new colleague who started in January, Adize Wilford, who's the Blackman Perry curator. And then C. Rose Smith is our assistant curator of photography. And then we have a curatorial fellow who is funded through Art Bridges, and her name is Kristen Pedroso.
Now, how would you say if you meet somebody who's a civilian and they say, "Patty, what do you do?" What do you tell them?
Like, what is the job of a curator?
Yeah, like what do you do? Like, what's your daily routine like?
Well, I always tell people that I don't have a daily routine because it's always different. Because I always am working on about like 7 projects at one time. Because there are things that are happening more immediately, like in May. Like, just as an example, like I'm working on something that's happening in May. And then I'm project managing 2 guest curated projects the following year. And then I'm working on reinstalling the entire new museum downtown. And then I'm working on a show of mine way down the line in 2028 with like a catalog. So there are many different things happening at one time and at different scales and different levels of involvement, right? And like I have to wear different types of hats, and sometimes I'm more of a project manager, but sometimes it's like all me, and so it really varies. But that's sort of like what I have going on at any given time. But
it sounded like, as you were describing that, your stress level went up a little bit. Is that one of those things where obviously each job has kind of its own level of stress or its own level of multitasking and plate spinning?
Sure.
Just out of curiosity, how do you compartmentalize? How does that work for you?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'm kind of accustomed to this at this point. So I think that helps for sure. Like, I don't think this world is for folks who like us. And I think that's what I didn't like about academia, is like it was too myopic. Like, it felt so like laser focused. And frankly, like, I don't love just one thing enough to like dedicate my whole life to, like that one thing. And I think it's because I'm curious. Like, I'm always driven by these questions. And I think like being able to have these different projects where I can explore different questions is something that I'm drawn to. I mean, yes, there's a limit, like how many plates can be spinning at once. And right now, like, I think it's like, I would say right now is, and you sensed my stress, but I would like to think that this is sort of like the apex of the stress, because, we're literally in two museums at once. Like, we're programming two spaces. We're not really going to close much at all between the two. So I would like to think that this is sort of like the peak of how many things can be going on at one time. But yeah.
Wow. Now tell me, I mean, there's a lot in there in terms of thinking about your daily activity. I mean, you mentioned so many cool things that sound like they're going on. Will you talk a little bit about some of the, let's be retrospective before we go, whatever the thing is when you talk about something in the future. Talk to me about some of the projects that you've been able to do there at the Brooks. What are some of the opportunities that you've been able to have there that are new to you?
Yeah. Let's see. New to me. Well, I think it's kind of like, it feels like a natural progression from some of the previous work. Like, it's a museum position. I'm familiar with that. I've worked with similar collections, but I'm sort of in the driver's seat, like I was, at U of M, but there's a team, which is delightful and I appreciate enormously. And so that's been nice to be back in museums, in many ways. But yeah, some of the projects that I've done since I started. So we also I started at a time, I think, where the Brooks was in a really big transition. There were first of all, I started at the end of 2021. So this is like coming out of COVID. It's interesting because I actually took about a year and a half or so off between, and like, in a way, I feel like I missed, in a good way. Like, I feel like I missed a lot. And I missed one of those things, which I don't feel great about missing, but it's interesting because I missed sort of the institutional reaction to like George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and how that manifested in either the university or museums or galleries. So that was interesting to come into in 2021. And like, you'd come across like vestiges of that, and you're like, what was this like committee, or like this policy, like, and I kind of came into some of that. And I actually, it would have been great to like be a part of that, I think. But the other thing that I don't regret missing out on was like all the COVID depression and policy changes, and like how that just decimated like visitors, and how we were going to like shift programming online and all of that nonsense. And so like, I'm just thankful to honestly not have been really anywhere but like at home at that point, because I feel for everybody who had to like work through that. So that was an interesting time to start. But the Brooks was really, going through like rebuilt, I think employees for a little while were furloughed. Some people left. There were a lot of departures during that time. So when I started, the staff, there were a lot of new folks. And I think that's been something for me, especially being at a former museum that was, had a lot of like long-term employees, and a lot of passing down of knowledge. That was something really challenging, I think, to walk into, was like that lack of continuity in process, procedure. And I think we've slowly started to like build that back, which is really great. But it makes me realize like that's something you really, if you can avoid it, like, you really don't want to have those lapses like that, because it's a very time consuming, almost intangible thing to be able to recreate. But in a lot of ways, museums are changing so much too. And in a lot of ways, I think, like, it was perceived as also like a fresh start as well. But, yeah.
Whoa. Okay, so there's a part of me that is like just having to tell myself, Hamlet, okay, we're going to end in about 10 minutes, and so we can't get everything, so just deal with that, Hamlet. Okay, now, what were some, I love that thing that you were talking about and all of those aspects in terms of thinking about coming into the Brooks and where the Brooks was at that particular time, and how all of that, there's probably never a perfect time to enter into a museum space in terms of what else is going on in the world. I'm curious, how do you think about yourself? We were talking earlier about responsibility or out of duty. You're at this institution now that really is sort of one of the two main institutions, main art institutions in terms of being in town. How are you thinking about that just personally? Maybe not necessarily for the whole institution, but how are you approaching that?
That's definitely something I considered when taking this position. At first, I was kind of like, I'm surprised they want to go with me because, I have decent experience. But I realized, like, taking this job, I think I realized, like, it's important. I think it was important to hire someone with a knowledge of Memphis. And I think that helped. To me, it felt like when I started in particular, there was like such a hole to dig ourselves out of, that like there was just no time to like get to know the community and get to know all of that. And I think that's changed. Like, I think that we've done enough digging that like we're there now for sure. But I did feel this like enormous sense of responsibility, especially somebody who had been in Memphis at that point for, I think, maybe 6 years, 7 years, no, something like that. 5-6 years at that point. So, I had gotten to know, and the university is a wonderful place to also like become so connected with the arts community here. And I just felt like the museum was in this huge moment of transition. And it's like a really sensitive one. And I think given some of my interests, like it seemed like a good fit for me to be there at that time to help ease that transition. And also just, like, I've had my kids here. I feel this tie to this community. And so it felt kind of like on a personal level, also something that was really important to me, that this project really succeed. And not just for day one, but like for the rest of its existence. And so, it's a big thing to think about, and I try not to think about it too much because it can be crippling, but I've become more comfortable with that idea over time. And as the new museum becomes more real and it gets taller every day, and I've become a lot more comfortable with that responsibility. But at the beginning, it's a lot. But just like everything's a lot, and you slowly realize like things get done, like it will get done, like that day will come, right? And there'll be days after that, and new projects and new undertakings. And so, I think that's just kind of where I am now. And I was going to say, I appreciate this opportunity to like reflect back, because I'm sure people have told you this, but you don't get that chance to really sit with like, what have I done and what has happened to me? And it's a really valuable thing to like reflect on. And
thanks for saying that.
Yeah.
To me, one of the things that I tell everybody about this project is that it's this occasion for me to sit down with people who I admire and who are making really wonderful things happen in the city, and then to be able to hold those stories in some way, I think. And again, every time I have this interview, I'm always like, man, I wish the 18-year-old Hamlet had heard this, or I'm looking forward to, a conversation down the road, or I'm hoping that my students will get something from this conversation. I really appreciate you coming in. I would love to have you back, seriously, when your mom's in town, or not really, but anytime, because I feel like there's still a ton of cool stuff to talk about in terms of the Brooks and what the Brooks is doing. And so, but I also know that you are very busy, and I appreciate you carving out the time. Thank you for coming in.
You're so welcome.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that was the second of 2 interviews that I recorded with Patty Daigle. The interview that you just listened to was recorded on March 7th, 2025. Please join us next week when we will have another interview. Until then, thank you for listening.